Hi, and welcome to today's episode. We start off just outside of Asheville, North Carolina, where a woman alone in her house is tormented by a creature that comes way too close for comfort. And then we head to Middle America, where a female hiker in Kansas is followed and circled by something so hideous and so interested in her that she's terrified, wondering what will happen next. Finally, a park ranger giving tours at Mammoth Cave, Kentucky sees something in the cave they've never experienced before. Something that should not be there. So grab a glass of your favorite drink and hunker down. Now let's get into the stories. Hi, Lilith. I'm writing in with my encounter story from North Carolina. My name is Barbara, and about 5 years ago, I was a single parent living just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. Anyone familiar with the area probably knows that the Great Smoky Mountains are nearby, as well as several additional national forests. I had moved down to Asheville from Pennsylvania with my ex to follow his job, but it ended up not working out. Unfortunately, that wasn't surprising, but I was then stuck in the area for a while until I could save enough money to afford to move back north. Before we divorced, I was a stay-at-home mom to our 2-year-old. I did have enough money to stay in Asheville for a few weeks while the legal stuff got sorted out, so that was good. I was spending my free time taking care of my toddler and applying to jobs back north whenever I could. One reason I was so intent on getting out of North Carolina quickly was that I wasn't used to this kind of rural setting. I thought I had grown up in a country area with a few dairy farms around, but I was definitely wrong. My ex-husband was a land developer, and we had moved down to North Carolina since their company was buying land and turning it into subdivisions. This was great for them, not so much for me. We moved into a little house in a more remote area, and our nearest neighbor was actually a logging company, so I didn't have anybody to talk to regularly. Sometimes I would call my sister back home to chat. She was married with a few kids of her own, or I would spend a while talking to the mail person, usually an older woman named Jen who would come down our long driveway to deliver the mail. I told Jen about the divorce. She was sympathetic, and I think she felt bad for me. After that, she hung around a bit more often to chat sometimes, and she was great with my daughter, and I was happy for some human interaction. With a little less than 2 weeks to go until I could move back home, winter started creeping up, and I wasn't thrilled with being way out in the woods in case a freak storm came through. So one evening, I was packing up the majority of the kitchen except for necessities. The house was surrounded by pine trees, so we were covered in shade relatively early in the evening, and it also got dark faster in our area. As I said, I wasn't comfortable in this kind of rural setting, so I was always keeping the garage light on so that I could see the top of the driveway where I parked my car. I had just started putting away a set of fancy dinnerware that we had been given as a wedding gift when I heard what sounded like a rock hitting the window. I stopped to listen, but I found it hard to concentrate since my daughter started making noise in her high chair. I walked over to quiet her down, and I heard the sound again, a little pinging sound, like rock hitting glass and bouncing off. It was coming from the direction of the living room. Immediately, I stiffened up. After all, I was alone living in this house with a toddler in an area I didn't really like. The nearest person would, hopefully, respond if I needed them. The lights were off in the living room, so I just stuck my head into that room and looked at the windows quickly. As I glanced around, a rock bounced off the far window, and I jerked back into the kitchen. Probably just a kid playing around, I tried to convince myself, but I knew there weren't any kids in the area. Kylie, my daughter, didn't seem bothered by what was happening. Obviously, she was too young. So I walked over to her, shushed her as if she was the one who needed comforting. For a few minutes, it was quiet, and I was just starting to catch my breath when I heard the garage door rattle. It was one of those big metal doors that you have to pull down over the carport. I ran to the kitchen window, and I looked out into the driveway where the light clearly outlined something walking around. At first, I thought I was looking at somebody in a Halloween costume. It looked like a werewolf getup, but I realized quickly that it was too realistic, not loose like I would expect a costume to be. What I was looking at was a large, dog-like creature standing on its hind legs. I could only watch as it moved around the side of the garage and made another banging sound. It must have been hitting the side of the garage for some reason. As soon as I couldn't see it anymore, I went and I grabbed Kylie and we went upstairs, where I could look down on the front yard out of our bedroom window. We stayed there for maybe 10 minutes before I heard a vehicle come down the driveway. It was the mail truck, with lights on, and I held Kylie tightly as I ran back downstairs to meet Jen. I didn't open the screen door right away, and she looked confused, waiting on the porch. "Hey," I said to her breathlessly, and then explained what had happened, why I looked that way. She listened without interrupting, only turning once to look at the garage door, which was closed. When I finished telling her about it, she stepped off the porch and went over to the garage. I warned her to be careful. She took her phone out, took a few pictures, and came back to the house to show me, through the screen door, the photos of footprints. And I can only describe them as really big paws. If I spread my hand out, they were larger than that, 5-toed. Jen could tell how freaked out I was, and she started to explain to me about the supposed creature in the area. I hadn't heard of it before. This wasn't any kind of legend I had heard of back home. She told me that there are a few reports every year, and that they're really similar to what I just said. These things, coming to remote houses and messing with things. They never hurt anybody, but they were always doing things to scare people. Banging on garages, throwing rocks. That was pretty standard, she said. She told me that if I hadn't gone upstairs, I probably wouldn't have even seen it looking through the first floor windows at me. All I can say is, I am happy I didn't. I probably would have had a heart attack. A few weeks later, as I planned, I moved back north to a much more populated area about 10 minutes away from my sister. Kylie's now 7, and every now and then I wonder if I should ever tell her this story when she's older. But I think she's like me, and it would probably mess with her more than anything. Anyway, there's no reason for her to really know about it. My ex is still in North Carolina, and it'll probably stay that way. I often wonder if he's encountered anything. Doesn't really matter though, because there's no way that I would be willing to ever go back down there. This encounter is not something I want to experience ever again. This encounter takes place in Holton, Kansas in October of 2013. It happened to a woman we'll call Julia. She asked us not to use her real name. At the time, Julia was an avid hiker who loved nature, and she would often take long hikes by herself in the woods near her home in Holton, Kansas, about 30 minutes north of Topeka. Hers was a small town in the middle of nowhere, in the northeast corner of Kansas. There were woods for miles all through many of the surrounding areas. Julia had hiked these woods many times, and she liked the solitude, as well as the familiarity of the woods. Her job as a cashier at the local grocery store didn't pay much, but ultimately it was enough to cover her modest lifestyle. She was the kind of person who didn't need much to be happy. Also, Julia didn't have many friends and spent most of her free time either hiking or reading. So one day in early October, she had a day off of work and decided to head to the woods and take a longer hike than usual. She had been feeling restless in the past few days because she wasn't getting along with some of her coworkers, and she just needed some time outside to clear her head. Basically, she felt that they were ganging up on her because she was more of a loner than any of them. So she packed a small bag with some food and water, put it all in her day pack, and set off into the woods. The weather was cool, but not too cold, and the leaves were just beginning to change color. Julia loved this time of year. As she hiked, she breathed in the crisp autumn air and felt her worries melting away. In fact, she got deep into thought about one of the books she was reading and got into a comfortable place in her head, sort of just zoning out. Because of this, she wasn't paying attention to where she was going, and it wasn't long before she realized she was off the path of her usual hiking trails. In fact, she had wandered into an area of the woods that she had never been to before. At first, she thought this new section of the woods was interesting, but soon she started to feel a bit uneasy, and for some reason, It felt strange to her in this part of the woods, like something wasn't right. But she figured it was just because it was unknown to her. But she also noticed that the air felt heavy, almost like it does before a storm. But today the sky was clear. That combination was strange and very noticeable. It crossed her mind to pause and wonder what could be wrong. She wasn't sure if she should turn back or continue onward and explore this new area. In the end, she decided to press on for a little to see what she could find and see if the strange feeling passed. As Julia continued to hike, she next began to hear strange noises. And at first she thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees, but the noise seemed to be getting louder and closer. She stopped and listened carefully. She decided that there was definitely something moving around in the woods, and it sounded like it was coming closer to her. It didn't take long before Julia's heart started to race, and she felt a wave of fear wash over her, even though she couldn't pinpoint what exactly was wrong. Her instincts were kicking in, even though her head couldn't make head nor tails of it. Again, she considered turning back, but she didn't want to give in to her fear, especially since she hadn't actually seen anything out of place. She told herself it was probably nothing and there was nothing to be afraid of, so she took a deep breath and continued onward. But the noise got louder, and before long Julia saw something moving through the trees ahead of her. It moved quickly, and it darted in and out of view. The worst part of it was that it seemed to be heading in her direction. She froze and stood in terror, staring in the direction of the movement, and watched as it got closer. Eventually it stepped into the clearing where she could clearly see what it was. And it was a huge, wolf-like creature, but definitely not a regular wolf. It was twice the size of a normal wolf with black fur and reddish eyes, and it also had somewhat human-like features, which was very confusing to her to not be able to categorize it. The creature continued walking and ultimately stopped about 10 feet away from her and just stared at her. Julia's heart was pounding in her chest. She wanted to run, but she was too scared to move. The creature slowly approached Julia and sniffed at her. It sniffed all around her, and then it stepped away. It seemed to be circling her now, and Julia's fear turned into full-blown terror. This thing was very interested in her, and at the same time it started to seem almost tame, and she started to think that maybe it did like her, maybe it wasn't going to hurt her. But still, there was no way to judge this thing since it was something she didn't even know. A creature that she didn't even have a name for. After a few minutes of checking her out and sniffing around her, the creature finally seemed to lose interest in Julia. It turned around and wandered off into the woods. It didn't turn around at all to watch her, but it did pause once it got into the trees, and it let out a loud, howling screech that had human tones to it. Julia stood there for a few moments trying to process what had just happened. She was shaken, but thankfully otherwise unharmed. She turned and quickly made her way back home, eager to tell someone about her strange encounter despite not having many close friends and not knowing who to call. The entire way back to her car, Julia couldn't help but feel like she was being watched. She looked over her shoulder multiple times, but she never saw the creature again. And when she got home, she quickly called the police and reported what had happened. They took down her statement and they told her that they would look into it. But Julia would later learn that after an extensive search of the woods, they never found any trace of the creature. Nothing at all out of the ordinary. Julia was left wondering if she had really seen what she thought she saw, or if it was all just a figment of her imagination. She decided to get on her computer and do some research on what she had seen. She soon found out that there have been reports of similar creatures, at least described the same way, all over the world. Some people believe that these creatures are actually werewolves, half-human, half-wolf beings that transform into their animal form under the light of the full moon. Others believe that they are a new species of animal that has yet to be accepted by science. Either way, she was convinced that she saw something that day in the woods, something that she will never forget. And even though she can't be sure what it was, she knows and believes that it was real. My strange encounter happened about a year ago. I know this story is not one of your typical encounters, but it happened. I've seriously been shaken ever since. I work at a national park in Kentucky. It's called Mammoth Cave. Mammoth Cave is a massive cave system currently known as the most extensive cave system in the world. It has over 420 miles of explored tunnels, and it's still expanding. The portion outside the cave is a large park as well. It's a great place to take a family on vacation. You can hike, kayak, and explore the cave. However, as I say this, I also preface with being cautious of your time inside the cave. I've worked at many parks throughout my career, and I have a niche in war history, specifically weaponry. Mammoth Cave was an exciting placement for me. The bats that live in the cave produce guano, bat poop, a key component to potassium nitrate, better known as saltpeter, used during the earlier wars. Enslaved people were forced to mine it. Several artifacts from that period have been recovered from the cave. And I'm not one to typically believe in wild tales, but after my encounter, I discovered your channel hoping to make sense of what I saw. Honestly, though, it has led me to believe that many things in our big world are unexplainable. Anyway, I digress. Part of working the caves means giving tours. Tours become monotonous quickly. Tourists are always asking the same questions and giving out the same answers over and over. Rinse, repeat. I always try to be engaging to elicit good tips. So this was a Tuesday and the second tour I had given that morning. I had a relatively large group of people. Part of the group was a family of 3, mom, dad, and a girl about the age of 10. The family was relatively quiet, but they seemed engaged throughout the tour. Of course, the cave comes with its legends. Some of these are spirits that haunt the cave, but I never gave this much thought. I never even considered that there was such a thing as a ghost. I always felt that ghosts were a bunch of hoopla created by simple-minded people. But I would, of course, tell the stories in the hopes of engaging my audience. But I had never seen anything to make me believe that there was any truth to it. So I led my group to the haunted chamber, and I noticed that the temperature had changed. The temperature change seemed odd because the cave keeps a consistent 54 degrees once inside and away from the entrance. Over my time working within the cave system, I had become accustomed to the temperature. I remember thinking that perhaps I was getting sick. As I began speaking to the group, the internal light system glitched. The lights were not going off, but they were dimming. The lights dimming was unusual. During this, I glanced at the family standing before me to the right, and the daughter suddenly pitched forward like someone had shoved her from behind. Her dad's quick reflexes saved her from a fall. I asked if she was okay, and she said somebody had pushed her. The strange thing was, her family was to the side, and nobody was behind them. I checked that she was okay and had my partner continue with the group while I attended to the family. As I leaned down in front of the girl, rocks started shuffling behind her. Small stones about the size of driveway gravel began rolling. The ground was unlevel in this chamber section, but not enough for the previously undisturbed stones to move. I told the family we should catch up with the rest of the group and leave now. As we exited the chamber, I saw somebody's back as they rounded a rock outcropping. Thinking that this was another tour member trying to be funny by being disruptive within a historic site, I quickly returned to the area to confront the hoodlum. Guess what? Nothing. Nobody was there. The entire room was empty, except for myself. There was nowhere someone could have hidden or gone to escape. So I'm nervous, anxious, and a little sick at this point. I quickly caught up to the rest of the group, and luckily we were at the end of the tour. I took the rest of the day off, and I debated returning to work the next day. I'm unsure if it was the girl, the time we were there, or me. I have no idea, but there is truly something supernatural inside Mammoth Cave. Thanks, Jason. Let me know what you think about these stories in the comments below. And don't forget to check out Donovan Dread, who releases almost every single day. Also, if you like true crime, then check out Donovan Dread True Crime. There are new releases several times a week.